I say none harm. I think none harm. And if this be not enough to keep a man alive, then in good faith I long not to live.
Welcome to the 100 Movies Every Catholic Should See podcast. I'm your host, Sam.
I'm Joe.
And today we have Joseph Pearce. He's a Catholic writer and literature scholar, particularly in the field of Tolkien Chesterton studies, and has written biographies on Shakespeare, Tolkien, Lewis, Chesterton, and many more great authors. And he just got back from Australia, where he did a series of talks, and we're very glad to have you.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So just to start off, especially for those who don't know you, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into literature and how this became your passion? And then we'll talk a little bit about film.
Okay, yeah. So I sort of grew up with a love of literature at my father's knee, so to speak. He was a great devotee of Shakespeare and could quote swathes of Shakespeare and other poetry, including Chesterton's The Donkey. But, I went off the rails as an angry young man. That's another story which I have written about, which is not for now. But I was not raised Catholic. I was not particularly even raised Christian. We never went to church, never prayed. Maybe sort of nominally Christian in the sense that if you asked us the question, we might have said so, but with no prayer life at all and no church life at all. I don't know what it takes to be a Christian, but I wouldn't say that we really qualified. So I'm a convert to the Catholic faith, and that was largely under the influence of great literary figures such as G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien. And so I'm aware of the power of these great writers to bring people to goodness, truth, and beauty, and indeed to the church. So I wrote my first book, a biography of G.K. Chesterton, as an act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, and as an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God. So when that was published, I took the plunge and became a full-time writer. And that meant I had to write about 2 books a year to not become homeless. This was back in England. That built a reputation, and on that reputation I was offered a job teaching in the United States at Ave Maria University, or Ave Maria College as it then was back in 2001 before it became a university. So I came to the States, and since then I've been sort of writing and teaching and speaking on the lecture circuit.
Great. And then sometimes appearing on small podcasts, which we appreciate.
My pleasure.
Since this is a film podcast, one of the things that we wanted to kind of talk about and explore today is the relationship between literature and film. Obviously, since the very beginning of film, literary adaptations have been very popular, going all the way back to the silent era to the 1800s. Lots of stuff going on there. But film itself is almost a literary sort of genre, a literary art form, because it is telling story in a very sort of almost as visceral a way as, for example, a novel or a short story can, but it adds a visual element to it. So do you have any thoughts on that sort of relationship between the two genres?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is, just to be a pedant here, literature is to do, and the literary is to do with writing, so I might quibble. But I would say perhaps the better word to actually draw upon the scholarship of J.R.R. Tolkien was to say that literature and filmmaking share the same mythopoeia. They're both mythopoeic. In other words, myth is story, poia is making or creating. So they're both storytelling arts. And in that sense, they have a great deal in common. The one thing I would say, and you will gather from this, and don't shoot me, that I prefer literature to film. I'm not an expert on film. Thanks for having me. I'll just do my best as an amateur to wax eloquent or otherwise. But for me, film is very passive, right? That the viewer of the film is allowing the director and the actors and all the various different moving parts that make a film do things to them that it will show them. Doesn't mean, of course, that the viewer does not have critical faculties to judge, but it does mean it's a more passive activity than reading, where your intellect is engaged and where your imagination is engaged in storytelling. You have to make the pictures for yourself. So, for instance, Tolkien criticized, although he didn't practice always what he preached, criticized the illustrating of books because he says that basically forces the illustrator's imagination upon the reader. Whereas if you're reading the book, you make your own picture of the hill and the buildings and the action and the characters. Where once you've got a picture in front of you, right, that's what's set in your mind. Which is why I always say that if you are going to watch a film adaptation of a great work of literature, do not do so until you watch until you read the great work of literature first. And the reason for that is quite simple. If, for instance, you watch the Lord of the Rings films before you read the Lord of the Rings, when you start reading the book, you get to Gandalf, you're going to see an image of Ian McKellen in your mind, whether you like it or not, right? Because your imagination has been gate crashed by the experience of watching the film first. If, however, you read the book first, you can then judge Peter Jackson from the perspective of your own imaginative engagement with the text. So it's very important to get it that way round. If you get it that way round, then I'm all in favour of people watching literary adaptations, film adaptations of great works of literature. But read the literature first.
I definitely agree with that. As someone who grew up doing a lot of reading, I find that my engagement with a book and with a film is stronger when I've already sort of experienced that in book form. And I think they're two different art forms. They can achieve very different effects, and it can be valuable both to read and to watch an adaptation. But reading first definitely helps to have that image in your mind, to have the language already there for you, and you can kind of judge the two in correlation with each other. Coming back to, though, you talk about literature being primarily written, and I do agree with that, but I will just sort of then throw out, what about, for example, the plays of Shakespeare, which are primarily also meant to be experienced in their dramatic form, played out upon a stage rather than read. There is an element of writing with filmmaking, with script writing. Is there some sort of overlap there? I don't want to fully cede film to the element of arts and not stick up for it as literary in some ways.
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. I argue always against people that say that plays are meant to be watched and not read. On the contrary, especially with Shakespeare, if you do not know the text, you will not understand the play when it's performed to you, because first of all, you're seeing it for the first time, especially with Shakespeare's English. But the other thing is that Shakespeare abuse is rampant, and directors of Shakespeare plays do all sorts of horrible things with Shakespeare's text.
Indeed.
They don't necessarily change the text. Let me give you one example from when I lived in England. I watched a performance of The Merchant of Venice in a city called Norwich in England, where every single one of the Christian characters was a skinhead. And they didn't change any of the words, but the way the words were spoken, on one of the points shouted, punctuated by spitting and kicking of Shylock, the whole meaning of the play was inverted and perverted without the text being changed at all. So it's very important for us to understand the text before going into watching the experience. So I think I'd say exactly the same thing about Shakespeare's plays as I would say about literary film adaptations of literature. Read first, watch afterwards.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Are there some what makes a great adaptation? Is it important to get try to get every scene in, try to be as faithful as possible? Or sometimes, like I did my thesis on Apocalypse Now, which we can argue about the merits of that movie, but it transports the themes and some of the plot of Heart of Darkness to a more contemporary setting. So not purporting to be Heart of Darkness, but being inspired by and taking some of the main themes so that a modern audience will appreciate it in the same way. I guess what makes a great adaptation of literature?
Well, we obviously have gradations here that very quickly become degradations if you're not careful.
Yeah.
So, in other words, at one end of the spectrum, you have a film that's endeavouring to be as true to the text in a literal and literary sense as possible. The other end of the spectrum, you have someone who's just taken the idea from a work of literature, the if you like, in the vague sense, the spirit of the work in order to do something very different, whether to contradict it or whether to be inspired by it and, if you like, dovetail with it. So they're two ends of the spectrum. I would say that this end of the spectrum, where the artistic license is taken to, I'm going to say an extreme because there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, but taken to the point where really the original work's only used as a springboard, a launching pad into something different, right? Well, that's fine for what it is, but it's not an adaptation of the work of literature, right? It's something inspired by the work of literature in order to do something different from the work of literature.
Oh, that makes sense. Do you have any personal favorite adaptations? I guess we could talk about Lord of the Rings. I don't know if that's one of your favorites, but certainly something that'd be great.
It's one of your favorite books for certain. I don't know about the movie.
We can start with Lord of the Rings, absolutely. Of course, that I love the books. But just where I stood on this, when the films first came out, I just moved to the States. I moved to the States 4 days before 9/11, so September the 7th, 2001. I'm not even sure if young people like you even remember 9/11, do you? I don't know how old you are. Yes. You look very young to me, but most people do. But the first Lord of the Rings film came out, Fellowship of the Ring, in December of that year. And at that time, I was the only show in town with respect to having a book out on the Catholicism of Lord of the Rings. So this actually also helped to launch me in the United States, if you like, because I was traveling all over the country giving talks on the Catholicism of Lord of the Rings. So obviously I love the book. When the films came out, we read this. I was living in Ann Arbor at the time, which is where Ave Maria College was at the time. And we hired the movie theater, a whole one just for our people, just local Catholics. And I stood up there on the stage in front of the screen before it started and gave a sort of 15-minute spiel. And then we watched the film together. So that was great. We did it 3 years in a row, of course, because it's 3 consecutive Decembers when the film came out, 2001, 2002, 2003. And I think then shortly after that, probably might even before the Return of the King came out, we had at Ave Maria the trial of Peter Jackson for the desecration of the Lord of the Rings.
Wow.
Which we also later repeated on the campus of Franciscan University in Steubenville. And there they used the imagination a bit more because they had a jury of undergraduates, and all the 12 undergraduates were all dressed as hobbits right down to their furry feet, which was very good. But as regards where I stand on the film adaptation, I would just say that I was the counsel for Peter Jackson's defense. Oh. And my argument was that, yes, if I could put my Tolkien purist hat on and find a list of things wrong with the plays as long as my arm, but I think that he kept to the spirit of the work well. He kept a large parts of the story, even though some things were left out and one or two things were distorted, some of it badly. Yeah. But for the most part, of course, what was on the wording of the charge was on my side, because so there may have been some distortion. There was not desecration. Right, so that's why I won both cases, both in Ave Maria and Franciscan. So I have a guarded love for the films. I have them up there. I can see the in the DVD sets up there on the shelf just in front of me. By the way, you can't see the reflection. That's actually Tolkien there. So he's up by the wall with me. I quite a place alongside Chesterton, who's to my left there. But anyway, so I happy to watch and rewatch and continue to enjoy the Lord of the Rings movies. I saw the first Hobbit movie. It was awful. Someone told me the second one was worse, so I didn't bother to watch it. I haven't watched the second or the third. And the real irony there is, for those that people know the story of the Hobbit, is that Peter Jackson destroyed the story because he was suffering from the dragon sickness. In other words, he wanted money. Just a whole horde, this dragon horde underneath him. Wasn't interested in being true to the story. He just wanted more gold. Yeah.
No, I'm glad to hear you stick up for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because I've had my differences with people in the Catholic world over this before, and I definitely think, although there are some problems with the movies, especially character-wise, I think technically it's an amazing film, just on the merits of filmmaking. One of the best things that I think we'll ever see. I think that film has sort of been on a downward slope ever since that. As far as the story and the characters go, I think that it did, for the most part, capture Tolkien's work, with the important exception of some of the most important characters like Frodo and Aragorn and Faramir. But for the most part, the spirit of it is there, and it definitely instilled a love of the Lord of the Rings in some people that then extended to reading the books and getting more into Tolkien. I think that there are more people interested in Tolkien today because of the films and the whole hype that was around them. And I think that that's a very good thing. That instead of people pitting the books and the movies together, typically fans of the one are going to be fans of the other, with the exception of a few purists.
Yeah, I agree. I would say one thing, just by way of defending Tolkien's text from the context of the film, that it was The Lord of the Rings was a surprising bestseller in the 1950s when it came out, and then it didn't do what most books do, have its run and then fizzle and fade. It then became a great favorite of the hippie subculture in the 60s. That's when it really took off over here, having already been a great success in the UK. And it carried on every decade. So in 1997, my book, Tolkien Man and Myth, was inspired by a string of opinion polls across the UK, which all of them, without fail, found The Lord of the Rings is the greatest work of the 20th century or of all time, usually getting 50% more votes. So, for instance, in one of the polls by you don't know all the footnotes, but one of the polls, one of the most prestigious from the point of view of the people polled, the greatest work of literature of all time, in third place was David Copperfield by Dickens. Second place was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. But in first place, getting 50% more votes than Pride and Prejudice with Lord of the Rings. But the critics were up in arms. One critic said he was so horrified by these opinion polls, one after the other. He said, "This just shows the folly of teaching people to read." So they were horrified, and obviously I was absolutely overjoyed. So I wrote my book as a way of showing that Lord of the Rings deserves to be the greatest book of the 20th century. So the point is, this is 1996, 1997, these opinion polls across the board, greatest work of all time, greatest work of the 20th century. And that's, of course, 4-5 years before the first Jackson film comes out. So in other words, Tolkien didn't need Peter Jackson. But I do agree with you that the Jackson film was, because they were so successful and so good for the most part, did introduce Tolkien to a whole new generation and, if you like, shot him further up into orbit. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think also keeping it in the people's mind, and as you were talking about with a whole new generation, the sort of internet age, that the people my age and younger who were just at the right age when The Lord of the Rings came out, I think, let's see, in 2003, I went to the theater to see Return of the King. I was 6 or 7 years old, I think, maybe even a little bit too young, honestly, to go see it, but my parents let me go. And I think my people my age, maybe a little bit older, a little bit younger, I had read the books, or rather my dad had read them out loud to us, by the way, before seeing the movies. So I will say we did it in the right order. But as attention spans kind of waned and things, I think that there did need to be something there to spark like a real cultural phenomenon to keep it going. Not to say that it wouldn't remain in polls of the greatest books of the 20th century or of all time. I think it definitely deserves that, and it would have continued to be popular. I just think it's more popular. Thanks.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this is we live in an age of distraction, and the consequence of distraction is attention deficit problems.
Yes.
So a lot of people don't read. Now that one positive consequence of Peter Jackson books, films, where they led people to read the books. And the good thing about that is, if once someone's read a book that's that thick, they're not going to be intimidated by reading any books.
Yes.
They're not going to look at books and say, I can't, that's too much. So it's the same defense, by the way, I make of Harry Potter. that irrespective of what we want to say about its literary or theological or moral merits or otherwise, it got a whole generation of people to pick up books that were 1,000 pages long and read them, and that's basically a good habit for a new generation of kids to get into. So the benefits of Harry Potter certainly outweigh, as far as I'm concerned, any negative connotations.
Yeah. And Tolkien's language also makes people a little bit more. Picking up Jane Austen doesn't seem so difficult, like you said, just because of the length of Tolkien, but also his language is elevated, the themes are elevated, everything's there, and so you feel more at home with an older work of literature. It doesn't have to be like with Harry Potter. Even the language is still pretty of its time. Whereas I think Tolkien,
we need to. I read something once called "In Defense of Archaisms," that basically that it introduces people to the beauty of the language. The Anglo-Saxons talk about, they didn't use a sort of an abstract term like vocabulary. They talk about each individual having their own unique word hoard. In other words, the number of words you carry on your in your bag, right, of words. That every new word is something that makes you wealthier, because we use words to communicate not just to each other, but first of all, reality to ourselves. Right? We don't have words to describe things. We can't think about them. I say that people, not just write as well as they read, they think as well as they read. And if you read well, your word hoard expands. You get a feel for the beauty and majesty of the language. You have a feeling of edification. You realize that you're higher and this is a better place to be than down there. It really it liberates you from the gutter. And allows you to literally at least allows you to fly.
Absolutely.
So this is one of the questions that you actually recommended. I think it's a great one. How do you adapt the Silmarillion? Do you adapt the Silmarillion? Let's say the Tolkien estate has given you the rights, because I don't know if anyone has the rights, and $100 million to do it. How would you do that?
I think the Silmarillion would need to be adapted in the form of probably 5 or 6 different films. The actual work itself is sort of fragmented. It wasn't written as one continual narrative. So you could have a whole film, for instance, on the story of Beren and Luthien. You could have a whole film on the Ainul and Dala. On the creation story of Middle Earth and Melkor and what have you. So there were several. The Fall of Valinor. There 5 or 6 3-hour spectacular films would do justice to the Silmarillion, but one film would not.
Yeah, and they'd all almost have to be in different styles or different genres too.
Yeah.
Something like the Ainulindale would I think I said that right. Would have to be more experimental, almost animated, to get the beauty and the reality of that across. Whereas like Beren and Luthien could be a more conventional, epic, like love story. The story of Turin Turambar would be a lot grittier, a lot darker. The Silmarillion is brilliant because it's a collection almost of myths rather than like a coherent one.
It's a bit like the Bible, right? I mean, if you look at the Bible, there are books that are poetry, there are books that are parables, there are books that are literal history, so it is a whole sort of compendium of various different literary genre. That's the Silmarillion. I think Tolkien's deliberately trying to do something similar. It's his elven scripture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it all kind of weirdly points to the same sort of events. You don't get a lot about the origin of man and what's happened there, but there's some clues there that seem to point towards the fall, the creation, the fall, the incarnation.
By preceding a fall as a recurring motif, right? Which obviously from the original sin to every generation since then, it's the battle between humility and its absence. In other words, pride. That's what really delineates the struggle of human existence and human history.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any potential for the upcoming Hunt for Gollum movie, or is that just Peter Jackson once more with the dragon sickness?
I've largely tuned out deliberately. If I've got friends such as you, for instance, who are guinea pigs, who will go there and watch it, and if you come back to me and really enthusiastic, say, you got to watch this. It's much better than any of us thought it was going to be. Then I'll dip my toe in the water. But I'm looking behind the finishing line. I'm an older person now. If I have spare time, I like to walk down to the creek, or listen to the sunset, or watch the sunsets, listen to the cicadas, or pick up a good book. My wife and I, we probably watch a film tonight. We don't watch films very often, but we probably will. We've got a night in, but it's not something I do often. I'm not a film buff. I do like a good book, and there are so many books that I haven't read I'd like to before I die, and so many books I'd like to read again before I die. And I say to people, when I die,
Yeah.
there'll be hundreds of books I wanted to read and dozens I wanted to write. But so why waste my time on anything but the best?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
I think that is very wise. I mean, yeah, we wanted to talk to you, not because you were a film buff or anything, because we wanted to talk about storytelling, because that's something we write about with film and you write about with literature. So getting that perspective from you is really great. Shifting gears a little bit, what would you say is your favorite Shakespeare adaptation? Is it Kenneth Branagh? Is it not Kenneth Branagh?
That's great. I mean, 90% of film adaptations of Shakespeare are awful. They're either awful. The older film adaptations are awful because they're inept, and the modern ones are awful because they're deliberate perversions and inversions of what Shakespeare's doing in the plays. So I find it very difficult to watch performances of Shakespeare, whether it's on film or on the stage. I have to know something about the producer and director, and whether I think they're actually going to authentically try to do Shakespeare and not do their own distortion of Shakespeare. It's a Gollumization of Shakespeare, shall we say, right? But my favorite, nonetheless, would probably be, because you can't do as much harm with this play. I mean, some plays, anyway, we won't go off on lots of tangents. It would either be Kenneth Branagh's Henry V or Laurence Olivier's Henry V, both of which I love dearly, and happy to watch sort of one in the light of the other.
What makes the two films different? Why is there value in watching both of them?
Well, first of all, both Sir Laurence Olivier and Kenneth Branagh are wonderful actors, and the way that they portray Henry V is marvelous. But the Sir Laurence Olivier version, first of all, it's produced during World War II, so there's an element of patriotism and even propaganda there, which normally I would not like, but I am an Englishman, That it starts on stage. What I love about it, the first part of the, I don't know if you know the film at all, but it begins, as a stage production, and then when they go off to France, all of a sudden now it's full, Technicolor, out with real horses and what have you. So it's sort of, if you like, the play walks through the wardrobe, right, from this world where we can only sort of see things, so we say secondhand, on the stage, through the wardrobe, where now we can sort of be there in reality. So I love that approach. Kenneth Branagh, I just the way that the Battle of Agincourt is depicted, his speech prior to the battle, and then, of course, the wonderful evocation of Latin Middle Ages with the chant, with the dead bodies, and the fact that he lingers on that. I mean, in this day and age, one thing I don't like about modern filmmaking is it's 4 or 5 different shots per second, right? You feel agitated. Your eye and your mind's not able to rest on any one image for any length of time, or the way that he took that extremely slowly, as a way of actually showing due decorum in the face of the dead, right? To show them due respect, and I think it was majestic. So I love both of those adaptations. There are very few others, however, that I have much time for.
Most of the time, if I see a Shakespeare adaptation that changes the time period or something, I know that's probably a clue. It's going to be a little wonky, like Richard III in Nazi Germany, or
Yeah, actually, this might surprise you, Joe, but that's less of a problem for me because the setting is, philosophically speaking, is not essential but accidental. So you know that you can set. I mean, because Shakespeare's writing plays on timeless themes.
Mhm.
So the point is that the Machiavellianism, which we see in Shakespeare's villains, is being played out by politicians and those in power in every generation. So I'm not so concerned about that. It depends what's motivating it. You know, if they're using it to bring in extra textual stuff. But no, my concern really is when they literally. I'll give you one example. I'll go back to The Merchant of Venice. It's a done thing now that that Portia and Bassanio cheat during the test of the castles. Well, if they're cheating, the whole moral compass of the play comes to nothing. There is no Belmont, you know, because that play basically you have Venice, the city of man, right? All the sins happening, and you have Belmont, the beautiful mountain, the city of God, right? And the two places don't really mix. What we're called to do is to ascend from one to the other. But you know, if Bassanio is trying to escape from that city of man, Venice, to ascend to the heavenly Portia's realm in Belmont, but then the two of them conspire to cheat during the test, right? And that's just the whole play plummets into the gutter of Venice and doesn't get out of it again.
Yeah.
And so that's a sort of example of what modern directors do with Shakespeare, which completely destroys everything that Shakespeare's doing morally and artistically.
Yeah. And my point about modern resetting the thing typically is because they're trying to make a more modern political point out of something that should be timeless. And I think setting something like Richard III or Merchant of Venice in Shakespeare's, or Romeo and Juliet for that matter, kind of gives it that timeless element. And then the dialogue sounds more, appropriate as well.
I can agree with that.
Switching gears from perhaps one of the most adapted authors of all time to one who surprisingly is kind of not so much. Let's talk a little bit about Chesterton. As I was thinking about Chesterton and Chesterton on film, the only films I could think of, or TV shows as well as films, that come from Chesterton's work is Father Brown. Father Brown seems to be the only Chesterton that appeals to filmmakers. And I'm wondering if that's either because the other works are a little bit too deep or a little bit too weird, maybe, to do on film, or what's the deal with that?
Well, my teenage daughter a few years back went through a Johnny Depp phase. I don't think weird is something that's going to put people off making films somehow. In fact, I think that Johnny Depp would be great in the Chesterton adaptation from one of his novels. For the popular audience, Father Brown's the best known character. Chesterton used to say whenever money was getting low and they had bills to pay, he would just write another one with Father Brown stories because they were going to make money. So that's a fairly obvious reason there. I would say, by the way, I do love the only feature film version of Father Brown of which I'm aware is this Alec Guinness version, the mid 1950s, which I actually love. It's so quaint and cute, and Alec Guinness is such a good actor. So that I would recommend that. The Kenneth Baker TV series in the early 70s I enjoy, but it's
I agree. It's
the one I've only seen a handful of the episode. One I was very pleasantly surprised by, but I think people tell me it's very hit and miss. And Father Brown's become sort of a modernist. He doesn't really mind about sexual sins, for instance, and the usual stuff. But for instance, I would love The Man Who Was Thursday or The Ball and the Cross to be made into films, and I think they would make absolutely superb films. And I think they need to be weird. They need to be a Johnny Depp type approach, but a weirdness which is not just madness. A weirdness, as in The Man Who Was Thursday or The Bull and the Cross, where what is madness, what is sanity, right? And who are the madmen? Same thing we see in King Lear. So So I think they would make astonishingly good films. I really do wish there was a mega billionaire Catholic out there with some sort of artistic vision to actually bankroll this. The other films that would be great if someone were to actually turn C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, those
Yes.
three.
Oh yes.
They would make marvelous films as well. So we need someone out there. You know, my experience of people with lots of money generally, and this certainly includes Catholics with lots of money, is they will give lots of money to put up a bricks and mortar building, which will then probably have their name appended to it. Then they will actually for artistic project, which will evangelize the culture and perhaps provide something which is timeless that will still be spoken about, watched, or read 100 years from now. They lack that imagination and the willingness to put their money where I think it would really do marvelous things to try to evangelize our culture.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think you're right about that. That's something I've thought a lot about in one of the themes of our blog and our work behind the scenes also is how to build that kind of a Catholic film culture. And I think that you would honestly have better luck trying to make an adaptation of a Chesterton, for example, than trying to pull some sort of completely new story, because there is that name there. And, you know, I can go to the Catholic Millionaire and say, hey, we're going to do Ball in the Cross, or we're going to do one of my favorite stories, Man Alive. And we can make that work really well. I think that might be the approach to take. I want to ask you in that vein, thinking about the Catholic film world, a lot of people who make like Catholic films, so to speak, they tend to stick to saint stories. They tend to stick to the holy people who really lived, like real life examples. Some of those can tend to be rather saccharine, rather, devotional, and there's sort of this reverence for the saint that you don't want to give them any rough edges, or is there a lane there for taking Catholic literature, of which there is just a lot out there? Even if you just look at the 20th century, I was looking at the catalog of like Benziger brothers here in the United States. There is a lot of untapped potential there. Is that perhaps a way that we could see sort of a Catholic film renaissance?
Yeah, well, again, we need vision.
Yes.
I'm obviously not going to be opposed to hagiography, but yeah, hagiography is very seldom good literature, and hagiography is very seldom good film. So, if someone just wants to have, some super pious, saccharine, oversweet depiction of someone who they venerate in prayer, then that's fine. I'm not saying there's not anything wrong with it, but it's not great art. And we need to have people with a vision to actually produce timeless art. Yeah, for instance, another favourite of mine is not technically. I don't know how you're defining film here, but for me, the early 1980s British TV adaptation of Brideshead Revisited is absolutely superb. And there, the story that I understand from that is they got I forgot the person's name now who took to write the screenplay, and he died in the middle of it. And they didn't have time to find anybody else, so they said, "Well, we'll just stick with Waugh's dialogue." and it literally is. I mean, even when the moments of sort of poetic, romantic landscape scanning sort of coincides with, Waugh doesn't wax lyrical about landscape very often. When he does it extremely well. Normally, one long paragraph at the beginning of a chapter, which is then mostly dialogue and action, but they did the same thing. I mean, it was literally like watching the novel brought to life. And so first of all, it proves to me it can be done. But the other thing about it, of course, is it's extremely expensive, because this is not a particularly long novel. And I think it's about 10 or 11 hours of film to bring this 250 300-page novel to life. So, getting the financing for it, I mean, that's one of the geniuses of Peter Jackson to manage to get, because think about that, basically 3.5 hour films. that were not cheap in the making, to get to sell that vision. And I think it was because they knew that if it was done well, that the Lord of the Rings could be the blockbuster. So he had managed to persuade people, and they were proved right, thankfully. But it's difficult to make that sell, to people to say, look, this has to be done well. We don't want it done badly. A great work of literature deserves a great adaptation.
Yeah. Is that kind of mini-series format perhaps better suited to, so like you mentioned Brightside Revisited, and yeah, watching that, you can tell sometimes for some scenes they literally were just using the book as the script. It's great. Also, I particularly like I think it's the 1998 or 1995 Pride and Prejudice miniseries, as opposed to any of the cinematic film adaptations. I think that there's just something about a series that lets it breathe a little bit more.
Who's it? My wife is much more an Austen aficionado than I am, and she's seen all the adaptations. I've seen relatively few. Who are the stars of that?
That one is Jennifer Ellie as Lizzie Bennet, and Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy.
Well, I thought that was I love the Colin Firth adaptation. I didn't know that was a miniseries. I thought it was a film.
It is, yes.
So in that case, we agree with each other then, and my wife would also agree with you that the Colin Firth. The fact we're calling it Colin Firth and not the name of the producer director says a great deal, because he really nailed Darcy. So no, that's my favorite, and I quite like the Sense and Sensibility with. Hugh Grant's playing Edward Ferrars. That's also
Emma
one
Thompson,
that I enjoy.
Yes.
But most of the more recent ones, they it's a feminist spin.
Yeah.
Right. That basically Elizabeth Bennet's not the decorous lady who wants to behave like a good Christian. Yeah. She's a feisty feminist who wants to get one up on the men. So that again, it's another example of how ideology poisons great art.
Yeah. I really liked what you said about timeless art, and like as Joe was saying, I also get into that conversation a lot with people about just about Catholic films and the idea that like, I've seen The Passion, I've seen these saint movies, and so those are all the movies I really need to see. And part of why we started 100 movies every Catholic should see was to show like, no, like there are a lot of really great films. Like obviously there's so many films you should avoid, but there are great films that are not necessarily Catholic. But that do point to good moral truths that are great. So I guess if you could, would you expand sort of on just in storytelling in general, especially for Catholics, the importance of creating timeless work that is not necessarily, as you said, hagiography, telling original stories about sinners who are just like us. What is the importance of Catholic literature not just being about saints?
Yeah, well, I mean, if I may just go off on a slight tangent for what you just said. You mentioned the Passion of the Christ, and I want to talk about that. That shows what you can do with the Saint of Saints, right? The Holy of Holies, right. Christ Himself. Because what Mel Gibson did there was absolute work of genius. It was brilliance. What he's made for us there is not a film in the traditional sense of the word. It's a moving icon, basically going through the stations of the cross with back flashes to Christ as a child and everything else. And again, it's about timelessness. Choosing not to have it in English at all, right? Choosing to have basically most of it in Aramaic with a little bit of Hebrew and Latin thrown in, and how's that going to work? No one's going to want that, right? Subtitles, you're kidding. But no, he produces something which is timeless. I mean, I don't want to get involved necessarily in liturgical discussions here, but that's the beauty of Latin and liturgy as well, right? Because it's a timeless element that's not rooted in fads and fashions, but something transcends such things. So, that's an example of how you can take a story which you've got to treat with the utmost kid gloves, because you'd be blasphemous if you handled it wrong, you mishandle it, but not be saccharine, Right. In fact, my only real complaint about the Passion of the Christ is I think that the scourging's overdone. I think the violence is just becomes almost gratuitous at some point. So it's the opposite of saccharine, right? But even that, it's gruesome. I mean, we normally fast forward that part. But you know, I put up with about 2 or 3 minutes of it, and I've got the feel literally, and then I'm going to fast forward from there. But you know that's an example of you don't have to add sugar to something which is already good, true, and beautiful. All the sugar does is spoil it.
Mm-hmm. I think I've only seen 2 films. Like, I love film. I think there's lots of great films that you can call Catholic out there, but there's only 2 that I've seen that I think actually transcend and become like sacred art. Both of them, honestly, actually are called The Passion. First is The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, and another one, a silent film from the 1920s called The Passion of Joan of Arc, which does a very similar thing. Yeah. It's just
I know nothing about films, but most of the films you mentioned I've actually seen, so maybe I'm not as ignorant as I think I am.
Well, good. There we go.
That's marvelous. I'd love to watch that again, and I do love. It's a perfect example. You know, obviously Howard Shore's soundtrack, The Lord of the Rings, was majestic, Wagnerian. It was what it needed to be. But Richard Einhorn's very modern soundtrack to that, it's a silent film, of course, needs music, and then you can get the music right becomes crucial. And I think Richard Einhorn's music for the soundtrack of that film is marvelous. In fact, I have a CD of it, so I can listen to it. Film soundtracks I don't like normally. I don't think they hold up as an integrated work of art because they're actually written to go with certain scenes, right? But there are exceptions, and so I do have the Lord of the Rings soundtrack, Howard Shore's, amongst my classical music CDs. So Shore's probably somewhere right next to Shostakovich or something. But then I've also got Richard Einhorn, The Passion of the Christ up there because it's marvelous.
Yeah.
The Passion of Joan of Arc.
Passion of Joan of Arc, yes. That's something that I particularly like about film, is that it brings together storytelling and drama with music, with visual art. And if all 3 of them together are working right, it can become a very powerful medium. Even Wagner, in its passivity, like you said earlier.
Wagner began that, of course. I mean, I love Wagner. That's controversial as a Catholic, but he's my favorite composer. There are many Catholic Wagnerians, but there are many people that are Catholics that do not like Wagner. But that was exactly what he was trying to do. For instance, with his Ring cycle, it wasn't just music. It had to be the whole theatrical performance, the staging, and so before film, he was actually trying to achieve what film is also trying to achieve. I think he called it total art, so
hitting all the senses in some way.
Hitler took it too far.
A little bit, of course. Yes. Bad people can like good stuff too. That's okay.
To alliterate total art as totalitarianism, right? Because I mean, what's it called? I'm going to say surprised by joy. No. Strength Through Joy. It's the Nazi propaganda film made by Leni Riefenstahl, which is a classic of filmmaking, right? And the technique she's using, the use of color, which is obviously new in the 1930s, that it was a pioneering work in cinematography, but it's at the service of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, which makes it painful to watch. But again, I would argue that if you're learning filmmaking, the history of film, you can't leave something out because it's unpalatable, right? Ideologically, you just hold your nose and learn what you can from it.
And same with like D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. It's absolutely necessary to watch that if you like film. And sometimes what I did Leni Riefenstahl with a film class in high school that I was doing, and I told them, I want you to like turn off that part of your brain that says Nazis are bad, and I want you to see if just like the emotions and the feel of this film can convince you to join the Third Reich. And then we'll unpack that later about how just the power of this can affect you even when you know this is evil I'm seeing.
Yeah, the power of propaganda, particularly using the new technology of film at the service of propaganda, and that's a lesson we all need to know, because many people in all sorts of political persuasions learned the lessons from Leni Riefenstahl about how you can use visual images to basically sell a lie, sell an ideology. But yeah, W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation, also, I mean, you think about how early it was. I've seen that as well. That's another marvelous piece of filmmaking, because you compare it with other films being made at the same time, and it's head and shoulders above its contemporaries, so it is a pioneering work, even if some of the scenes in it now, I would say, by the way, some of the scene, most of it is not in the least bit offensive. You got when the Ku Klux Klan gallop in like the 7th Cavalry, that's a bit of a problem, right? But that's probably, I don't know, I can't remember, it's been some 10 or 15 minutes of a 3-hour film or something. I mean, it doesn't define the whole work. The blemish on the whole work. It doesn't,
But then you could also see the influence on that on like John Wayne films, like Stagecoach, when the cavalry comes in. It's like, okay, I'm seeing how this was used for the Ku Klux Klan, like you said, galloping like the 7th Cavalry. Now we're seeing it with the good guys, or who the film is trying to convince you the good guys, that the U.S. cavalry.
Right, exactly.
What literature would you put in that category that is important to read, maybe as a writer, but you would not agree with what is being said?
That's a great question, and a difficult one, because I argue that, logically speaking, there are 4 types of books. There are good books, good bad books, bad good books, and bad books. By which I'm talking about the work as art, as literature, but also the work as something which presents goodness, truth, and beauty authentically, in reality, should we say, on that deeper metaphysical level. So it can be good in one sense and bad in the other. Obviously, something's bad is bad in terms of morality and art, then why would you bother? But it becomes a bit more difficult. So, I spend a lot of time reading new Catholic fiction, because I just want to have my finger on the pulse of what's happening in the culture. Much of it's actually surprisingly good, but obviously some of it isn't. So I do find myself reading some bad good books, bad art, good theology. But really, what my usual argument is, there are so many hundreds of good books. Why would you waste your time reading anything else? But your question was more nuanced than that, because you say, what about if you want to learn as a writer? In other words, you want to learn not truth, not goodness, truth, and beauty from the art, which presumably you already have from elsewhere, but how do you tune your writing skills? So in that case, I mean, I would say that a writer that I find difficult to read just because of his problems is James Joyce. But James Joyce writes very well. I find that the defeatism and almost nihilism of George Orwell's 1984 difficult, right, when basically Big Brother completely triumphs. But the way that he depicts the dystopia and the tyranny is something everyone should experience, not least because it is applicable. So I tend to be. You've obviously asked me a good question here, because I'm grappling and groping, but I tend to be someone who's very tradition oriented, and I would say the challenge is not to see who were considered avant-garde in the 20th century. I would say the challenge is to go back and rediscover great writers who have been neglected because their style is too high. So Alfred Lord Tennyson in the UK, for instance, these high romantics, Longfellow in the United States. I recently gave a talk on Evangeline at the Chesterton conference, Longfellow's long poem. So I would say the real challenge is get yourself back in the tradition. Challenge yourself to read and understand, and even emulate, impersonate, imitate writing styles that are considered archaic, as a way of honing and tuning your own voice. So for me, for instance, if I read anything I wrote 20 years ago, and it sounds like now for me a rather poor pastiche of Chesterton, and lots of alliteration, lots of paradoxes thrown in there, and the rest of it. I think I found my own voice. You can still see anybody that reads what I write can see that there's a love of Chesterton and there's a Chestertonian influence, but it's not so on the surface. It's a pastiche. But you have to sort of you have to learn from the best, right, and write like the best, and then somehow or other through honing your own skills, sort of find your own voice where they are there, if you like, as a chorus in the background, but they're not the domineering voice, but an influence.
Yeah, well,
that's excellent advice.
Yeah,
and something just since we're a film podcast, that I'll swing back to film. When I was doing some research and reading about screenwriting, a piece of advice that really stuck with me. There's lots of chorus of people who say read a whole bunch of screenplays to learn how to write a screenplay. But I forget who was. It might have been David Mamet, who's a playwright first, but also does screenplays. Who said, "Don't read screenplays. That's a horrible idea. Completely ignore screenplays. You can learn the structure of a screenplay from reading like Robert McKee's story, and that's all you need. Read literature, read the greats, and that's how you will hone your voice as a writer." That's just wonderful advice, and something that's really stuck with me.
Yeah, well, that's very encouraging to hear that people get it that way. Is that you've got to know the best and try to at least be experienced and influenced by the best if you're actually going to produce anything worthwhile. Chesterton said that the coming peril, he said this back in about 1930, said the coming peril wasn't Bolshevism, it was standardization by a low standard. So the dumbing down of everything to a level of mediocrity. So if you don't want to play that game, you have to aspire towards the best, and you only aspire towards the best by experiencing the best.
Yeah, fully agree. Well, before we conclude, is there anything you would like to anything that you are working on that you would like to share to our audience? Any upcoming books or more lectures?
Well, I've got so much going on. I wouldn't know where to start or finish. And obviously, we need to finish. I would refer people to my personal website, jpearce.co, jpearce.co, because that's where I post everything I'm doing. And also, I have exclusive content for those that want to go, as C.S. Lewis would say, further up and further in. And it's also, there's a tab for all my books with links to the publishers' websites. So if you want to, because I don't publish with just one publisher. So if you want to see what I write and be able to get ready access to anything that catches their eye, again, the website would be the place to go.
Great.
jpearce.co. Awesome. We'll send everyone there. We'll put that in the show notes as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This is 100 Movies Every Catholic Should See podcast, signing off.